Chinese history is taught in a very specific way. Mao Zedong takes over the country, Great Leap Forward, Cultural Revolution, Deng Xiaoping takes over, Chinese economic boom. It seems like a logical story, a political upstart seeing the writing on the wall for their current system and taking over from the old guy who was becoming increasingly erratic and delusional. But this jump from one policy to another didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen directly. There was one man who was instrumental in bridging the gap, Hua Guofeng. Hua Guofeng is often skipped over, left as a footnote at best. This is for a few reasons, one of which is simply the scarcity of information about him. My main source for this video is the book Mao's Forgotten Successor by Robert Weatherley, and I'll link a few other miscellaneous sources in the description. In my opinion, the book is very good, though with a few minor problems. The otherization of Chinese culture common in Western literature about China presents itself in this book, but it doesn't distract from the main points and facts. Okay, back to Hua. Hua Guofeng was born to a poor family in 1921 in Shanxi in northern China. Hua Guofeng actually wasn't his original name. He was born with the name Su Zhu. Hua Guofeng is essentially an acronym for Chinese Anti-Japanese National Salvation Vanguard, a wartime moniker for what would become the People's Liberation Army. It was a fairly common phenomenon for members of the Communist Party at the time to adopt revolutionary names, though most were usually more subtle than this. Details about Hua's early life are extremely sketchy, but we know he joined the Communist Party around 1937 when Japan invaded China. Shanxi became one of the main areas of operations for communist guerrillas, and many local citizens also took up arms. Hua Guofeng became an instructor, teaching locals how to make homemade grenades and landmines. These tactics proved helpful in assisting the main anti-Japanese force in the area, the 8th Route Army. The 8th Route Army has a really messy history, but this is the unit that would later become the People's Liberation Army. While Hua wasn't really important to the cause directly, it was assuredly beneficial for his later career to have this early connection. Hua was later made chairman of a small guerrilla group known as the Joint Anti-Japanese Association. This was a ragtag group of whatever random civilians Hua could muster into semi-cohesive units. Its objectives were extensive, including sabotage and espionage against Japanese troops in Shanxi. A favorite tactic was stealing food and water from Japanese camps. Hua apparently would sometimes personally participate in these activities, and was known for his inventive tactics. One of his favorites was reportedly putting up scarecrows in the middle of the roads where Japanese soldiers would be traveling. The soldiers would be angered by these blocking their way and kick them over. They would be met with a surprise. Hua around this time is remembered as a loyal Maoist, always carrying a copy of Mao Zedong's book On Protracted War with him. For his effectiveness and devotion to the cause, Hua was promoted to a cadre position of the Jiaodong Party Central Committee in western Shanxi. He was able to expand his sabotage operations and played a key role in the defense of Jiaodong County in 1943 and 44. An extensive report about Hua's successes were sent to the Communist Party headquarters at Hunan in 1943. Mao was allegedly very impressed with the news and wrote back that the example of Jiaodong County should be a model for the rest of Shanxi. This is probably the first time Mao learned of Hua, but this was an extremely busy time for Mao, and realistically he was forgotten about almost immediately. After the war with Japan ended in 1945, the civil war between the communists and nationalists quickly resumed. Hua kept his role as essentially a grassroots communist organizer, and helped repel a nationalist attack on the communist base at Yan'an. He did the same in the Luliang campaign against the warlord of Shanxi, Yan Xishan. After the Luliang campaign, that gave the communists a foothold in Shanxi, they set out on the grueling Taiyuan campaign to capture the capital of Shanxi. The city was heavily defended by nationalist forces and had to be worn down by artillery barrages over the course of months, finally falling in 1949. The fall of Taiyuan was a major blow to the nationalist cause, and earned Hua another promotion for his help with intelligence gathering and sabotage of nationalist supply lines. This time, he was promoted to Yangchu County as General Secretary of the Communist Party there. As General Secretary of the county, Hua oversaw the implementation of Mao's land collectivization and reform. Hua was adept at picking good people to head the program at more local levels, generally selecting those who had been harmed by the old land tenancy system and were respected locally. According to later communist sources, Hua would allegedly personally help with tasks on farms that had been redistributed. Hua built a reputation in Shanxi as a diligent, smart, local official. Keyword being local, however. He didn't get nearly the attention others in the region did, especially military leaders such as Lin Biao, Peng Dehuai, or Deng Xiaoping. Nonetheless, he gained valuable experience in grassroots civilian organization, experience that would serve him well at his next post, in Hunan. Hua was made party secretary of Xiangyin County in Hunan, Mao's home province, in 1949. This was part of a program called the Southbound Work Groups, essentially communist teams that followed behind the army as they drove the nationalists out of the country. They especially focused their efforts in areas where support for the communists was weak. The county wasn't doing very well in the aftermath of the Civil War, and Hua had an uphill battle in front of him. People from the richer Hunan province didn't like the idea of being ordered around by some Shanxi villager. Flooding had made thousands homeless, and nationalist remnants had become bandits, stealing from the population. Implementing land reform, completely reorganizing the lives of most inhabitants of the county, was going to be exceedingly difficult. Hua began his work by tackling the banditry issue. With PLA officers now at his disposal, he began forming civilian militias en masse. Allegedly, many of Hua's local political opponents were also labeled bandits and were pacified. With help from the army, the bandit problem was solved within a few years. In Hunan, Hua really began to solidify himself as a Mao loyalist. The provisional communist government before him had deviated from Mao's plans for land collectivization. Mao had previously drawn up a detailed hierarchy for the organization of peasants, which had been ignored in Xianyin. The exploitative landlords had been simply replaced by middle-class peasants who kept exploiting the poorest peasants in the same way as the landlords. Hua was appalled by this development and used some Maoist doctrine to rectify the situation. He began forming mutual aid teams. These were groups of households, usually around a dozen, that would pool tools, labor, food, and anything else members of the group needed. This created a way for lower-class peasants to fix their financial problems without needing help from richer groups. Mutual aid teams proved effective, and land reform was completed 3 years after their introduction, in 1953. Hua wouldn't be in Xianyin to see the completion of this, however. In mid-1951, he was transferred to a different county in Hunan, Xiangtan. On paper, this was a lateral move, keeping his same position as party secretary of a county. In reality, this was a small promotion. Xiangtan was bigger than Xianyin, and crucially contained Mao's hometown of Shaoshan. If you wanted to get Mao's attention, you could hardly ask for a better post. Hua later said Xiangtan was the first place he met Mao in person. There's not a lot of information about Hua's leadership here, but we know he kept setting up new mutual aid teams, and allegedly got a commendation from Mao for his efforts. He led one of the first major uses of pesticides in China in response to a locust outbreak in the county. This worked, and motivated Hua to write articles critiquing other provincial leaders, who he saw as having too theoretical of thinking and being unwilling to work in practical terms. Hua visited Mao's childhood home multiple times during his tenure, and sent a proposal to the Communist Party Central Committee in Beijing for its renovation and conversion to a historical site. This request was approved, and Hua personally oversaw the renovations. Hua was gaining traction and attention from higher-ranking officials and enthusiastically moved forward at the next stages of land reform. This was founding the agricultural producers' cooperatives, like mutual aid teams but bigger and more for achieving agricultural goals. Over 5,000 cooperatives were founded in Xiangtan, around half of the total number in Hunan. On average, agricultural production increased by 90% in areas with cooperatives. Hua was so ardent about these that he moved on to the next stages of cooperatives ahead of schedule. This got him into trouble with immediate superiors in Hunan, but earned praise from Mao in Beijing. This probably led to Hua's next lateral move, this time to Changsha. He was made head of the Culture and Education Office, with the task of improving the region's abysmal literacy rate. 83% of Hunan could not read, slightly higher than the national average of 78% illiteracy. This was in 1956, the same year a large nationwide literacy program had begun. Hua had a few programs to tackle the issue, chief among them being the adoption of simplified Chinese and the pinyin romanization system. Teachers were sent out to teach adults the new simplified system, and Hua would reportedly teach some classes himself. He helped set up new schools, many of these run by his beloved mutual aid teams and agricultural cooperatives. He headed a regional commission for the eradication of various diseases, particularly snail fever, which affected around a sixth of the Chinese population at the time. Hua would even get to talk about the disease at a national conference. A lot of records about Hua at this time go against the traditional narrative of him being something of an egotistical opportunist. Hua refused to have his name on papers and reports he was the primary author of, even when it would have been beneficial for his career. Hua was respected by his superiors for being an effective, thorough, reliable official. While not particularly innovative, he knew how to leverage available resources to achieve real results in Hunan. His hard work in the region didn't go unnoticed, and in 1959 he was once again promoted as a senior party secretary in Hunan. This was in the midst of the Great Leap Forward, which would dominate most of his efforts during this period. He was shuffled around to various local temporary posts for a few years, before settling as the head of coal production in Hunan. Hua took some risks during the Great Leap, notably criticizing unnamed officials for setting unreasonably high production goals. Considering someone much more important like Peng Dehuai was almost killed for a poem about potatoes, it's a minor miracle he made it through unscathed. Subtly raising dissent was something he really had a knack for. One of his most significant deviations from Maoist orthodoxy occurred at this time. Increasing grain production was one of the Leap's foremost goals, but Hua pointed out a few problems. Mainly, his concerns that this could lead to coercion and a reduced quality of life of the farmers and hurt land collectivization efforts. He did this in 1958, when enthusiasm for the Leap was at its highest. Again, minor miracle nothing happened to him for this. The Great Leap Forward was a pretty major failure, but Hua made it at least look like it succeeded in Hunan to his bosses. Hua made great efforts to revitalize the economy of Shaoshan, Mao's hometown. Mao visited his hometown during this time, and while we don't know exactly what happened, Hua was promoted to the head of the Communist Party in Hunan. It's hard to say exactly how much Hua exaggerated the success of the Leap, but it's more likely this promotion was a reward from Mao for his loyalty. Many high-ranking communists in Hunan had made public criticisms against Mao for the Great Leap Forward, and Hua was probably seen by Mao as someone he could trust to replace them. Hua again got sent around to various local posts, this time as part of the Down to the Countryside movement that encouraged or mandated all sorts of people to go work in rural areas. Current leader of China, Xi Jinping, famously participated in this. Hua was deeply concerned about various food and material shortages throughout the province that were persisting into the 1960s. These shortages had been noticed in other parts of the country, and were severe enough that Beijing had to create a new national policy to rectify the situation. A national conference headed by Mao Zedong, Liu Shaoqi, and Deng Xiaoping led to the Three Freedoms, One Guarantee policy. This policy allowed for small amounts of free market activity in the agricultural sectors. Hua fought against these reforms, and sought to protect the communal system. It's unclear precisely what measures he took. It's even possible, though unlikely, that he made up this supposed opposition later to attack Deng Xiaoping. But it was probably true from what we know about his previous collectivist tendencies. He finally stopped being moved around, and was able to fill his official role in 1964. As party secretary, he led the construction of many canals and irrigation systems in Hunan. Purportedly, he would frequently visit the construction sites and implement new worker safety rules as needed. The mid-60s was when Hua really began climbing the ladder, in the midst of debatably the most important event in modern Chinese history, the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution's goals were ill-defined, to say the least, but perhaps the true goal, at its core, was to solidify Mao's power. Hunan was recorded by Mao to be one of the provinces that supported his plans for the revolution, along with Hebei, Hunan, Zhejiang, and Hubei. Large numbers of students and young industrial workers were mobilized to fulfill the party's vague goals of cultural revolution, and in Hunan this led to what might be best called a civil war. Red Guards clashed with university students who clashed with factory workers who clashed with the children of army officers. It wasn't uncommon for hundreds of teenagers to be in the streets beating the hell out of each other with sticks. It was bad enough that the army had to be dispatched to Hunan to deal with the situation. The government did, of course, support some of these organizations, one of which was a radical group of industrial workers known as the Gonglian. In May 1967, the Gonglian arrested Hua and other senior party leaders in Hunan and detained them in the Changsha car manufacturing factory. The Gonglian were in a power struggle with a few other groups and attempted to convince Hua to support them to gain legitimacy. Hua, ever cautious, refused to give a yes or no answer. The Gonglian got fed up after a few weeks and tried convincing some of the other officials they arrested. This whole ordeal prompted the intervention of Zhou Enlai, who ordered Hua to be released and for him to be flown to Beijing. Zhou twisted Hua's arm here and had him support the Gonglian and make a public statement pledging to return to Mao's revolutionary line. Hua never departed from Mao's doctrine in the first place, but sure, whatever. With his 7-week detention sorted and the support of probably the second most important person in the country, Hua returned to Hunan to set up a new government. This was a temporary revolutionary committee, staffed mostly by army officers and local senior Red Guards. Mao visited Hunan during this time and talked at length with Hua. It's theorized this was the meeting that might have swayed Mao to consider Hua for higher positions than his provincial roles. He probably wasn't being considered as a successor just yet. Lin Biao was still holding on to that spot. Even besides Lin, there were a lot of people ahead of Hua in that line. Still, Mao was scouting new recruits for the many empty government positions left by the Cultural Revolution. It's in this way that Hua can be considered one of the few direct beneficiaries of the Cultural Revolution. These benefits paid dividends very soon after, and in 1971 Hua was given a position in Beijing. He worked as an assistant to Zhou Enlai, handling many practical issues in things like forestry and agriculture. He got this position in the aftermath of the Lin Biao affair, where Lin had supposedly attempted a military coup and a defect to the Soviet Union. Hua had backed Mao during the incident, but he later denied any involvement. Mao was impressed by Hua's work for Zhou, and emboldened him to develop political skills to match his practical ones. Mao was probably subtly telling Hua to toughen himself for the challenges he would face in the heart of Chinese politics, and be on the lookout for potential future opponents. 2 years later, he was promoted to a place where this advice would come in handy, the Politburo. Hua's appointment was a bit of a surprise, but it was nothing compared to the meteoric rise of Wang Hongwen. A completely unknown labor activist just 6 years prior, Wang had skyrocketed to the third most important office in the country in 1973. He had completely avoided association with any scandals, and came from a genuinely proletarian background. He even served in the Chinese Expeditionary Force in Korea during the Korean War. At just 37 years old, he was one of the youngest people in the Politburo. Wang was fairly plainly being considered as Mao's successor. With Mao's implied blessing, Wang was able to take some incredible political risks, and form some interesting alliances, as we'll see. In 1974, the Politburo embarked on a new political campaign, known as Criticize Lin Biao, Criticize Confucius. This campaign claimed Lin Biao was somehow a radical Confucianist who wanted to restore feudalism in China. It was supposedly aimed at those who supported Lin, but in reality it was to purge more moderate elements from the government, particularly Zhou Enlai, and by extension, Hua Guofeng. The targeting of Hua was mostly orchestrated by Mao's wife, Jiang Qing. In another example of Hua's good luck, the campaign died out fairly quickly, and didn't have a major impact on anybody's political careers. Mao himself had killed the campaign, but that didn't mean Jiang Qing was done with her attacks on Hua just yet. This split between moderates and radicals in the government would lead to the creation of the semi-official Gang of Four. Led by Jiang Qing, she and 3 of her close associates, including Wang Hongwen, controlled many of the cultural and educational systems of the country from the late 60s to the early 70s. Their exact activities are still somewhat murky, and it's hard to say what actions at this time were their doings. Mao was probably unaware of most of their ventures, but he began to publicly criticize them in 1975 when they attempted to censor one of Hua's films. Hua was a pretty big fan of movies and helped make a ton of dramas and documentaries throughout his career. Many of these were deemed too moderate or even counter-revolutionary by the gang. Mao at this time wished to open up cultural spaces, and had severe disagreements with the gang's attempted straitjacketing of expression. In 1975, Hua was made one of 12 vice premiers of China. This put him very clearly in line for succession, but he was not without competition. You had Deng Xiaoping, the pragmatic capitalist, Li Xiangnian, the veteran revolutionary, Zhang Chunqiao, one of the Gang of Four, and a few others. Hua was in reality ahead of many others, as he was tasked with handling science and technology, the main focus of the government at the time. Hua also got to draft and give talks on agricultural policy, and clashed with the Gang of Four over what priorities for farming should be. Hua argued that the mechanization of farms was more important, making sure they have tractors and such. The Gang of Four wanted to focus on ideological indoctrination and communist education. Gee, what could make a farm more efficient? A tractor? Or a pamphlet? It's a real thinker. Who could win this one? The modernization plan won out, with a slogan that sounds like a Daft Punk song: more, better, faster, economical. Deng Xiaoping was also involved, and supported Hua's proposals. Deng and Hua disagreed on many things, and probably disagreed here too, but Deng needed to fall in line. Deng had been one of the Cultural Revolution's foremost victims, and had just been rehabilitated. Mao was keeping a close eye on him, and causing a fuss about agriculture would have been a bad look. This didn't end up mattering, as Mao had completely soured on Deng by the end of 1975. Zhou Enlai had been fighting bladder cancer for a few years at this point, and his position as premier was expected to be filled by Deng. When Zhou died in 1976, Mao appointed Hua as premier. There's a lot of debate about why Mao promoted Hua to this position when there were a few candidates ahead of him. According to Mao, it was because of his kind and honest character. It was more likely finally a culmination of Hua's hard work and loyalty. That isn't to say the other candidates weren't hardworking or loyal to Mao, but they had other pressures on them that made them more risky. Li Xiangnian, for example, had worked closely with Mao since the 30s, but he was also a friend of Deng Xiaoping. While Mao almost certainly would have preferred someone more radical, none of the available options had anywhere near the level of Hua's experience. Hua was the perfect compromise candidate. After his appointment, Hua's power continued to be threatened. The main danger was Deng Xiaoping, whose new thinking was slowly but surely gaining ground. Hua participated in assaults on Deng Xiaoping throughout 1975, most notably the Criticize Deng Xiaoping campaign, or the Counterattack the Right Deviationist Reversal of Verdicts Trend campaign, if you like lengthy titles. It was a three-pronged attack against Deng, from Hua, Mao, and the Gang of Four. Is that 6 prongs? Hua was again a moderate in this time, however. The Gang of Four were pressing for extremely aggressive strikes, but Hua was worried that could cause too much instability. Luckily for Deng, the campaign became rather softball attacks against his ideas, rather than the Cultural Revolution-era attacks against, him. Instability wasn't totally avoided, but the opposition was relatively minor. Hua solidified his position as Mao's successor by handling a more major public crisis, that being the protests in Tiananmen Square in 1976. Public discontent with the Gang of Four's growing influence in politics, especially in 1976 when Mao's health began to fail, was on the rise. Zhou Enlai was perceived as an anti-gang force, and many people were upset that public mourning of him had been suppressed. Protests occurred around the country, with Nanjing and Beijing being the most affected. Hua was put in charge of handling the situation, while Wang Hongwen was left to handle the messaging around the response. It was a very clear indication that Mao had settled on Hua as his successor, and he was promoted to full premier shortly after, as well as head of the Communist Party. Deng Xiaoping was also dismissed from all his official posts. In the last 6 months of Mao's life, he made sure Hua got as much media attention and responsibility as possible. He was put in charge of the response to the major Tangshan earthquake, for example. It was around this time the infamous note was given to Hua, a barely legible scribbled note by a man who may have been too unwell to speak or write. With you in charge, I am at ease. There's much that could be speculated about this note. The most obvious is that the note could simply be fake, made up by Hua to bolster his legitimacy. Hua only revealed the note after Mao died. It is decently likely that the note was faked, but it was almost guaranteed that Hua was Mao's chosen successor. A point in support of the note being real is that there were actually multiple. Jiang Qing even attempted to alter one of the notes to imply that she was Mao's legitimate successor. Mao died on September 9, 1976, and Hua assumed power shortly afterward. There's a lot that happened afterward, especially with the Gang of Four. They attempted to sabotage his career almost immediately by intercepting communications from the provinces to Beijing. Jiang Qing tried getting access to Mao's personal documents, likely to alter or forge documents. The gang also submitted a bid to the Politburo to replace Hua as chairman. There's even some allegations they were planning a forceful coup using militias they had ties with. The situation was becoming obviously unacceptable, so Hua called a secret Politburo meeting in October. The Politburo, with the gang not in attendance, unanimously voted to arrest the Gang of Four. The arrests were to be carried out by Wang Dongxing, the head of Mao's bodyguard unit. The Central Guard unit of the PLA executed the arrests the next day, with orders to shoot to kill if there was any resistance. Thankfully, the arrests were completed peacefully. The next day, the Politburo had another unanimous decision, this time appointing Hua as chairman of the party and the Central Military Commission. Hua now had the full set of top government offices. He'd also secured a new ally in Wang Dongxing, creating a clique known as the Secret Police Left. With help from a few other security officials and the mayor of Beijing, they ensured there were no security incidents after the arrests. With their arrests, Hua had seemingly secured his power. The move was popular within the party and well received by the country. Deng Xiaoping, his next biggest threat, was still powerless, and, with his new secret police friends, he had a solid security apparatus to fall back on. It was hard to believe he would lose power in just a few short years. Hua's leadership was troubled from the outset. The country was still suffering from various levels of socio-economic collapse, including strikes and industrial slowdowns. The national railway system was practically non-functional in some provinces. The Cultural Revolution was still technically going on, though nobody really wanted Maoism anymore. Deng Xiaoping was on the opposite side of the country, in Guangzhou, still with no official power. Nonetheless, many were calling for his rehabilitation. In January 1977, small glass bottles were placed around Beijing by Deng's supporters, since the word for small bottle in Chinese sounds similar to Xiaoping. The next month, Hua received a letter from some high-ranking Politburo members with 3 questions. First, was Hua planning to continue the Maoist system, and if so, why? Second, was Hua legally the leader of China? He hadn't actually followed the constitutional procedures to get that role. Third, what to do about Deng Xiaoping. Mao had probably overreacted by completely purging him, and many wanted him reinstated. After much internal pressure and debate, Hua agreed to reinstate Deng in March. While many Politburo members, including the ones pushing for Deng's return, were threatened by his influence, his reforms were the only feasible path to fix the country. Faith in the party had to be restored, and everyone could see it. With Deng back, he and Hua became locked in a fairly intense struggle for leadership. Both had to make the arguments that they were the true inheritors of the mantle of Mao, and Hua made absolutely disastrous decisions in this regard. Hua promised to do more cultural revolutions and expand the persecution of anti-revolutionary and bourgeois elements. This was just about the worst thing he could have said. Nobody wanted to continue the Cultural Revolution, let alone start new ones. But, in his defense, was there really another option? He couldn't exactly start backtracking and undoing the work of the man who appointed him as leader. Sure, he was a moderate who was never very enthusiastic about the Cultural Revolution, but this wasn't a time for moderates. He had to be decisive, something he wasn't very good at. The backlash to this was harsh, so Hua implemented a new policy to try cementing his rule. This was the two whatevers policy. Whatever policies Chairman Mao decided upon, we shall resolutely defend. Whatever directives Chairman Mao issued, we shall steadfastly obey. This backfired horrifically, as Deng used it as proof that Hua and friends were incapable of making their own decisions. They were given the derogatory nicknames of whateverists. For Hua's next brilliant move, he attempted to usurp Mao's cult of personality. He had books and pamphlets made about him in huge bulk, the contents of which exaggerated his activities in the 30s and 40s and his connection with Mao. Tons of posters and portraits of him were made, with the title Chairman Hua on them. He would sometimes even try to adopt the same poses and hairstyle as Mao, sort of similar to what Kim Jong-un is doing in North Korea with Kim Il-sung. He also constructed Mao's famous mausoleum, which still stands today. This was technically illegal, as the Politburo had passed a law in 1949 forbidding the construction of mausoleums or overly fancy graves for dead party members. In the Hua-Deng conflict, it would ironically be Deng to take a moderate stance. Deng brought back a fairly obscure piece of Mao's writing, the essay Seek Truth from Facts. Mao wrote in this essay about how it was important to ensure ideology worked in practice, and that an ideology that couldn't get results should be changed. Deng's proposed policies were still vague at this stage, but they encompassed a general opening up of Chinese society and the economy. This approach was a piece of tactical political genius by Deng. It gave him an opening to attack pretty much anybody he wanted, without appearing to be anti-Mao. He was able to make convincing arguments that this was the best application of Maoist thinking given the circumstances. He was playing Hua at his own game, and was winning. Deng's ideas were really gathering pace, and there was now a distinct line in the sand between Maoism and reform. With a bit of pull in the government, Deng could begin expanding his influence. Hua had the secret police left, made up of security officials, and Deng had his own power groups he had built. While in de facto exile in Guangzhou, he gained the backing of two important generals, Shu Shiyou and Wei Guoqing. He found a few veteran communists, Yao Yilin and Chen Yun most notably. He also brought a new younger generation of leaders, most notably Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang. In Hua's camp, his alliances were falling apart. The secret police left pulled in completely opposite directions, and forced Hua to make promises he had no chance of keeping. Some thought state funding should be more allocated towards light industries and consumer goods, while some wanted to increase state investment in heavy industries like petroleum. Both of these were important, but Hua had promised the secret police left to follow the light industry plan in exchange for their help in arresting the Gang of Four. He couldn't lose out on the heavy industry plan either, so he promised to do that plan as well. Hua had dozens of problems like this that were all beginning to conflict with each other around this time. Deng did what he could to encourage these problems. For example, the Air Force was asking for additional military funds to be allocated to bolstering air bases and defenses along the border with the Soviet Union and Mongolia. Deng encouraged his general friends from Guangzhou to demand the money be spent on protecting China's southern coast, and for the money to be spent on the Navy. Hua wasn't experienced in dealing with conflict between military branches, and Deng made sure the problem was as troublesome as possible. While the conflict between Hua and Deng was certainly fierce, it is suggested that the two were respectful to one another and held each other in fairly high regard. It was a much more gentlemanly political dispute than one might think from the information available about the particular events. Deng's attacks were absolutely crushing, however. One of his most important was severing Hua's control over local politics and policy. For example, his ally Zhao Ziyang had begun getting rid of collective farms and allowing private farms in Sichuan. This soon spread to other provinces, particularly Anhui, and represented a brazen disregard for Hua's policies. While Hua was busy trying to keep everything together in Beijing, Deng had a free hand to coordinate support at a provincial level. This provincial support would be crucial in his later rise to power. It's an interesting switch of strategy from the two men. Deng had always been more comfortable finding support from urbanites and the educated and politically involved. Hua had found his base previously in remote and rural areas, generally far from the centers of power. How Hua could have such an oversight to allow Deng free reign of his former base of power is puzzling. Deng was able to completely purge Hua's supporters from many provinces, especially by bringing back more senior leaders who lost their positions in the Cultural Revolution. They were able to easily outmaneuver the younger, less experienced incumbents. Many of Hua's allies also had ties to the Gang of Four or Lin Biao, and Deng could get them thrown out of office by simply reminding the locals of this fact. Deng soon had the support of leaders in every single province, and forced Hua to concede more political ground. One point was rehabilitation and justice for the victims of the Cultural Revolution. The Tiananmen incident from before wasn't counter-revolutionary anymore, in fact, it was revolutionary now. By extension, Deng was no longer counter-revolutionary for his role in opposing the Cultural Revolution. Deng was able to bring many of his friends into the Politburo, firmly tipping the future votes in his favor. The Politburo completely tore up Hua's economic plans, allowed privately owned farms, and changed the official title of Mao Zedong to be Comrade Mao instead of Chairman Mao. This change stuck for all future Chinese leaders, and was a big blow to Hua's attempted cult of personality. This power struggle caused a brief lapse in authority over cultural and educational matters, allowing for the freest time in Chinese literature in recent memory. Slews of books about the reality of the Cultural Revolution and the misery of the common people were published, reinforcing Deng's reputation as a needed reformer. This freedom of thought led to the Democracy Wall movement, where handwritten posters and notes from disgruntled citizens were put on walls around central Beijing. People were expressing their candid opinions about many controversial subjects in the country. Many posters were directly criticizing Hua and his policies, especially the two whatevers, which many considered to be as Chairman Mao controlling Hua from beyond the grave. Deng intensified the pressure by bringing up how Hua and his followers weren't legally allowed to have the positions they occupied. Deng was committing illegal acts by purging Hua's supporters in the provinces, but ignore that. Wang Dongxing, for example, one of Hua's closest supporters, was only legally authorized to lead one army unit, but was now in control of the whole national security apparatus, and as previously discussed, Hua had been in violation of the constitution in his own rise to power. The Democracy Wall movement began growing out of Deng's control, and many activists turned on him. Deng had no intention of truly establishing a democracy in China or holding multi-party elections. Deng had the posters removed and the leader of the movement arrested when he arbitrarily decided they had gone too far. By February 1980, Hua's support had completely evaporated, either removed from office by Deng or they themselves had turned on Hua. By August, Hua literally had no supporters in the Politburo or other top government offices. Literally zero. In June 1981, Hua was dismissed from office. He was allowed to keep a minor role in the Central Committee starting in September 1982, but his career was now effectively over. Just like that, it was done. Hua was at the top for 4 years, and only really had control for 2 years. He was able to keep his minor Central Committee role until 2002, when he retired for health reasons. He passed away a few years later in 2008. Hua Guofeng's career might not have been exceptionally remarkable, but that's what makes it remarkable. He ingrained himself in the Maoist system, and was one of its biggest beneficiaries. He understood the fundamentals of the country, but couldn't correctly apply these concepts at a national level. He made terrible mistakes at crucial junctions, but his overall softening of policy compared to Mao was needed for Deng's reforms. He allowed for greater rehabilitation of those affected by the Cultural Revolution, and arrested the biggest hardline Maoists in politics. He opened China's first special economic zone, creating what is now the huge modern city of Shenzhen. He did eventually understand his mistakes, and allowed Deng to take over and reform the country without any trouble. In the end, Hua Guofeng's legacy is one of quiet influence rather than revolutionary change. Though his time at the top was short, he bridged two eras, paving the way for China's transformation while stepping aside to let history take its course.